But when the woman dressed him later in rough cotton clothes, yellow with age, he looked exactly what he was, an orphan in a workhouse, ready for a life of misery, hunger, and neglect. Oliver cried loudly. If he could have known that he was a workhouse orphan, perhaps he would have cried even more loudly. There was no one to look after the baby in the workhouse, so Oliver was sent to a special baby farm nearby. There, he and 30 other children rolled around the floor all day without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing. Mrs. Mann, the old woman who looked after them, was very experienced. She knew what was good for children, and a full stomach was very dangerous to their health. She also knew what was good for herself, so she kept for her own use the money that she was given for the children's food. The board responsible for the orphans sometimes checked on the health of the children, but they always sent the beadle, a kind of local policeman, to announce their visit the day before. So whenever the board arrived, of course, the children were always neat and clean. This was the way Oliver was brought up. Consequently, at the age of 9, he was a pale, thin child and short for his age. But despite frequent beatings by Mrs. Mann, his spirit was strong, which was probably the reason why he managed to reach the age of 9 at all. On Oliver's 9th birthday, Mr. Bumble the beadle came to the house to see Mrs. Mann. Through the front window, Mrs. Mann saw him at the gate and turned quickly to the girl who worked with her. "Quick, take Oliver and those others upstairs to be washed," she said. Then she ran out to unlock the gate. It was always kept locked to prevent official visitors walking in unexpectedly. "I have business to talk about," Mr. Bumble told Mrs. Mann as he entered the house. He was a big, fat man, often bad-tempered, and was full of self-importance. He did not like to be kept waiting at a locked gate. Mrs. Mann took his hat and coat, placed a chair for him, and expressed great concern for his comfort. "You've had a long walk, Mr. Bumble," she said, "and you must be thirsty." She took out a bottle from the cupboard. "No, thank you, Mrs. Mann, not a drop." He waved the bottle away. "Just a little drop, Mr. Bumble, with cold water," said Mrs. Mann persuasively. Mr. Bumble coughed. "What is it?" he asked, looking at the bottle with interest. "Gin. I keep it for the children's medicine drink." "You give the children gin, Mrs. Mann?" asked Mr. Bumble, watching as she mixed his drink. "Only with medicine, sir. I don't like to see them suffer." "You're a good woman, Mrs. Mann." Mr. Bumble drank half his glass immediately. "I'll tell the board about you. Now, the reason why I'm here. Oliver Twist is 9 years old today. We've never been able to discover anything about his parents." "Then how did he get his name?" "I gave it to him," said Mr. Bumble proudly. "We follow the alphabet. The last one was an S, Swabble. And then it was T, so this one is Twist. The next one will be Unwin. Anyway, Oliver Twist is now old enough to return to the workhouse. Bring him here, please." While Mrs. Mann went to get him, Mr. Bumble finished the rest of his gin. Oliver, his face and hands now almost clean, was led into the room. "Will you come along with me, Oliver?" asked Mr. Bumble in a loud voice. Oliver was very glad to be free of Mrs. Mann's violence, but he said nothing because she was angrily shaking her finger at him. However, as the gate closed behind Oliver, he burst into tears. He was leaving behind the other children, the only friends he had, and he realized at that moment how lonely he was in the world. Mr. Bumble walked on with long steps, with Oliver on his short little legs running beside him. The feeling of contentment produced by gin and water had now disappeared, and the beadle was in a bad mood once more. Back at the workhouse, Oliver was taken to see the board. He stood in front of 10 fat men who were sitting around a table. "What's your name, boy?" asked a particularly fat man with a very round red face. Oliver was frightened at the sight of so many people and started to cry. "Why are you crying?" The beadle hit him on the back, and so naturally Oliver cried even more. "The boy's a fool," one member of the board announced. "You know you have no father or mother," said the first man, "and that you have been brought up with other orphans." "Yes, sir," replied Oliver, crying bitterly. "Why is the boy crying?" repeated the other man, puzzled. "You have come here to be educated," continued the fat man, "so you will start working here tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Oliver was led away to a large room where, on a rough, hard bed, he cried himself to sleep. The room in the workhouse where the boys were fed was a large stone hall, and at one end the master and 2 women served the food. This consisted of a bowl of thin soup 3 times a day, with a piece of bread on Sundays. The boys ate everything and were always hungry. The bowls never needed washing. The boys polished them with their spoons until they shone. After 3 months of this slow starvation, one of the boys told the others he was so hungry that one night he might eat the boy who slept next to him. He had a wild, hungry eye, and the other boys believed him. After a long discussion, they decided that one of them should ask for more food after supper that evening, and Oliver was chosen. The evening arrived, the soup was served, and the bowls were empty again in a few seconds. Oliver went up to the master with his bowl in his hand. He felt very frightened, but also desperate with hunger. "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He looked at the little boy in front of him with amazement. Nobody else spoke. "What?" he asked at last, in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master hit him with the serving spoon, then seized Oliver's arms and shouted for the beadle. The beadle came quickly, heard the dreadful news, and immediately ran to tell the board. "He asked for more?" Mr. Limpkins, the fattest board member, asked in horror. "Bumble, is this really true?" "That boy will be hanged," said the man who earlier had called Oliver a fool. "You see if I'm not right." Oliver was led away to be locked up, and a reward was offered to anybody who would take him away and use him for work. Chapter 2. Oliver's First Job. Oliver stayed a prisoner alone in the dark room for a week. He cried bitterly all day, and when the long night came, he spread his little hands over his eyes to shut out the darkness, and tried to sleep. He was given freezing water to wash with, and was beaten daily by Mr. Bumble in front of all the other boys in the hall, as a warning to them. One day, Mr. Bumble met the local undertaker, Mr. Sowerberry, outside the workhouse. "Do you know anybody who wants to train a boy for work, Mr. Sowerberry?" Mr. Bumble pointed at the notice on the wall above him, which offered £5 to anybody who would take Oliver Twist for work. Mr. Sowerberry rubbed his chin and thought for a while. "I pay enough for the poor with my taxes," he said, "so why shouldn't I be able to make use of them in my work? Yes, I'll take the boy myself." And so the board agreed to send Oliver to work for the undertaker. The necessary papers were signed. Oliver's small possessions were put into a brown paper parcel, and he was led to Mr. Sowerberry's house by Mr. Bumble. As they walked along, tears began to run down Oliver's face. "What is it this time?" asked Mr. Bumble impatiently. "Don't be so ungrateful. This gentleman is going to look after you." "It's just that I'm so lonely, sir," said the child. "Everybody hates me. Please don't be angry with me, sir." Even Mr. Bumble felt a little pity. He coughed, told Oliver to dry his eyes and be a good boy, and walked on with him in silence. The undertaker had just finished work for the day when Mr. Bumble entered his shop. "Here, I've brought the boy," said the beadle. Oliver bowed to the undertaker, who raised his candle to get a better view of the boy. "Mrs. Sowerberry," he called, "come and have a look." His wife, a short, thin woman with a disagreeable face, came out to see. "He's very small," she said immediately. "He is," agreed Mr. Bumble, "but he'll grow, Mrs. Sowerberry." "Yes," she said crossly, "when he eats our food. Go on, get downstairs." She pushed Oliver downstairs into a damp, dark kitchen and called to the girl working down there. "Here, Charlotte, give this boy some meat that the dog left, if he thinks it's good enough for him." Oliver tore the meat to pieces with his teeth as if he were a wild animal. Mrs. Sowerberry watched him in silent horror, already thinking about her future food bills, then took him upstairs to the shop. "You'll sleep here among the coffins," she said. Oliver stared around the dark, airless shop at the coffins, some finished, some only half made. He trembled at the thought of ghosts. His bed was a small hole in the floor and looked very like a grave. But it was not only the room that depressed Oliver. He felt very lonely, with no friends and no one to care for him. As he lay on the bed, he found himself wishing that it really was his grave. The next morning, he was woken up by someone kicking at the shop door. "Open the door, will you?" shouted a voice through the keyhole. "Yes, sir." "I suppose you're the new boy," said the voice through the keyhole. "How old are you?" 10, sir." "Then I'll hit you when I get in," said the voice. Oliver was experienced enough to know that the promise was probably true. He opened the door with a shaking hand, then looked up and down the street. All he could see was a large boy wearing the uniform of one of the charity schools where the children of the very poor used to go. "Did you want a coffin?" asked Oliver innocently. The charity boy looked at him fiercely. "You'll be needing a coffin soon, workhouse, if you make jokes like that. I'm Mr. Noah Claypole, and you're working under me. Now hurry up and open the curtains." As he said this, he kicked Oliver and entered the shop. He was a big, clumsy boy of about 14, with a large head and very small eyes. Added to these attractions were a red nose and dirty yellow trousers. The boys went down to breakfast, which the girl Charlotte had made for them. She gave an extra piece of meat to Noah, then told Oliver to hurry up, as it was his job to look after the shop. "Did you hear that, workhouse?" shouted Noah. "He heard, Noah," said Charlotte. "Leave him alone." "Why?" asked Noah. "All his relations have already left him alone. His mother and father aren't going to interfere with him." Charlotte and Noah both started laughing loudly. Oliver sat alone in the corner, eating old bits of bread. Noah was a charity boy, but not a workhouse orphan. He at least knew who his parents were. But for a long time, all the local shop boys had insulted him because he wore the uniform of a charity boy. Now fortune had brought him a creature in an even lower position in society than himself. Noah intended to repay to Oliver every insult he had ever received, and to make the new boy's life a misery. After a few weeks, Mr. Sowerberry decided that he liked Oliver's appearance enough to train him in the undertaking business. Oliver's permanent expression of sadness was very suitable, the undertaker thought, for collecting dead bodies from houses and accompanying the coffins to funerals. One day, Mr. Bumble came to tell them about a woman who had died in an extremely poor part of the town, and Sowerberry and Oliver went to collect the body. They went down dirty, narrow streets, where the houses on either side were tall and large, but very old. Some of the houses were almost falling down, and had to be supported by huge blocks of wood. The area was so poor that even the dead rats in the street looked as though they had died of hunger. They found the right house and climbed the dark stairs to a miserable little room. Some children watched them from the shadows as they entered. Something lay beneath a blanket on the floor in one corner. A man and an old woman stood near the body. Oliver was afraid to look at them. With their thin faces and sharp teeth, they looked like the rats he had seen outside. As Sowerberry began to measure the body for a coffin, the man knelt on the floor and cried out, "She starved to death, I tell you. That's why she died." He fell to the floor, and all the children behind him started to cry. Sowerberry and Oliver, their work done, left as fast as they could. They returned the next day with the coffin and 4 men from the workhouse who were to carry it. The man and the old woman followed the coffin to the church and waited silently by the grave for the priest to arrive. When at last he came, he hurried through the burial prayers, and as quickly as possible, it was only a job after all, the coffin was put into the ground. At this point the husband, who had not moved once during his wife's burial, not even during the long wait for the priest, suddenly fainted to the ground and had to have cold water thrown over him. "So, how did you like it, Oliver?" asked Sowerberry later as they walked home. Not very much, sir," Oliver answered truthfully. "You'll get used to it, my boy." Oliver wondered how long that would take, and remained silent all the way back to the shop, thinking about everything that he had seen and heard. Chapter 3. Oliver Goes to London. Oliver was now officially an undertaker's assistant. It was a good, sickly time of year, and coffins were selling well. Oliver gained a lot of experience in a short time, and was interested to see how brave some people were after a death in the family. During funerals for some rich people, for example, he saw that the people who had cried the loudest in church usually recovered the fastest afterwards. He noticed how in other wealthy families the wife or the husband often seemed quite cheerful and calm despite the recent death, just as if nothing had happened. Oliver was very surprised to see all this, and greatly admired them for controlling their sadness so well. He was treated badly by most of the people around him. Noah was jealous because Oliver went out to burials while he was left back in the shop, so he treated him even worse than before. Charlotte treated him badly because Noah did, and Mrs. Sowerberry was his enemy because Mr. Sowerberry was supposed to be his friend. One day something happened which might seem unimportant, but which had a great effect on Oliver's future. Noah was in a particularly bad mood one dinner time, and so he tried to make Oliver cry by hitting him, pulling his hair, and calling him horrible names. This was all unsuccessful, so he tried personal insults. "Workhouse, how's your mother?" he asked. "She's dead," replied Oliver, his face going red with emotion. Noah hoped that Oliver was going to cry, so he continued, "What did she die of, Workhouse?" "Of a broken heart, I was told," and a tear rolled down Oliver's cheek. "Why are you crying, Workhouse?" Oliver remained silent, and Noah grew braver. "You know, I feel very sorry for you, Workhouse, but the truth is, your mother was a wicked woman." Oliver seemed suddenly to wake up. "What did you say?" "She was so bad it was lucky she died, or she would have ended up in prison or hung." His face bright red with anger, Oliver jumped up, seized Noah's throat, and shook the older boy so violently that his teeth nearly fell out. Then he hit him with all his strength and knocked him to the ground. "He'll murder me!" screamed Noah. "Charlotte, help! Oliver's gone mad!" Charlotte and Mrs. Sowerberry ran in and screamed in horror. They took hold of Oliver and began to beat him. Then Noah got up and started to kick him from behind. When they were all tired, they forced Oliver, who was still fighting and shouting, into the cellar and locked it. Mrs. Sowerberry sat down, breathing heavily. "He's like a wild animal," she said. "We could all have been murdered in our beds." "I hope Mr. Sowerberry doesn't take any more of these dreadful creatures from the workhouse," said Charlotte. "Poor Noah was nearly killed." Mrs. Sowerberry looked at Noah sympathetically. Noah, who was twice Oliver's size, pretended to rub tears from his eyes. "What shall we do?" cried Mrs. Sowerberry. "He'll kick that door down in 10 minutes. They could hear Oliver banging and kicking at the cellar door. "Noah, run and get Mr. Bumble." So Noah ran through the streets as quickly as he could to fetch the beadle. When he reached the workhouse, he waited for a minute to make sure his face was suitably tearful and frightened. As soon as Mr. Bumble came out, Noah cried, Mr. Bumble, it's Oliver Twist, sir. He's become violent. He tried to murder me, sir, and Charlotte and Mrs. Sowerberry as well." Mr. Bumble was shocked and angry. "Did he? I'll come up there immediately and beat him with my stick." When he arrived at the shop, Oliver was still kicking wildly at the cellar door. "Let me out," he shouted from the cellar when he heard Mr. Bumble's voice. "I'm not afraid of you." Mr. Bumble stopped for a moment, amazed and even rather frightened by this change in Oliver. Then he said to Mrs. Sowerberry, "It's the meat that's caused this, you know." "What?" "Meat, madam. You fed him too well here. Back in the workhouse this would never have happened." "I knew I was too generous to him," said Mrs. Sowerberry, raising her eyes to the ceiling. At that moment, Mr. Sowerberry returned, and hearing what had happened, according to the ladies, he beat Oliver so hard that even Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Sowerberry were satisfied. Mr. Sowerberry was not a cruel man, but he had no choice. He knew that if he didn't punish Oliver, his wife would never forgive him. That night, alone in the room with the coffins, Oliver cried bitter, lonely tears. He did not sleep, and very early in the morning, before anyone was awake, he quietly unlocked the shop door and left the house. He ran up the street and through the town as far as the main road, where he saw a sign that told him it was just 70 miles from there to London. The name London gave the boy an idea. That huge place. Nobody, not even Mr. Bumble, could ever find him there. He had heard old men in the workhouse say it was a good place for brave boys, and that there was always work there for those that wanted it. It would be the best place for him. He jumped to his feet and walked forward again. But after only 4 miles, he began to realize just how far he would have to walk. He stopped to think about it. He had a piece of bread, a rough shirt, 2 pairs of socks, and a penny. But he could not see how these would help him to get to London any faster, so he continued walking. He walked 20 miles that day. The only thing he had to eat was his piece of bread and some water which he begged from houses near the road. He slept the first night in a field, feeling lonely, tired, cold, and hungry. He was even hungrier the next morning when he woke up, and he had to buy some more bread with his penny. That day he walked only 12 miles. His legs were so weak that they shook beneath him. The next day he tried to beg for money, but large signs in some villages warned him that anyone caught begging would be sent to prison. Travellers on the road refused to give him money. They said he was a lazy young dog and didn't deserve anything. Farmers threatened to send their dogs after him. When he waited outside pubs, the pub owners chased him away because they thought he had come to steal something. Only 2 people were kind enough to feed him, an old woman and a gatekeeper on the road. If they had not given him some food, he surely would have died like his mother. Early on the 7th morning of his journey, Oliver finally reached the little town of Barnet, just outside London. Exhausted, he sat down at the side of the road. His feet were bleeding, and he was covered in dust. He was too tired even to beg. Then he noticed that a boy, who had passed him a few minutes before, had returned and was now looking at him carefully from the opposite side of the road. After a long time, the boy crossed the road and said to Oliver, "Hello, what's the matter then?" The boy was about Oliver's age, but was one of the strangest-looking people he had ever seen. He had a dirty, ordinary boy's face, but he behaved as if he were an adult. He was short for his age and had little, sharp, ugly eyes. His hat was stuck on top of his head, but it looked as though it would blow off at any minute. He wore a man's coat which reached almost down to his feet, with sleeves so long that his hands were completely covered. "I'm very tired and hungry," answered Oliver, almost crying. "I've been walking for a week." "A week? The magistrate's order, was it?" "The magistrate? What's that?" "A magistrate's a kind of judge," explained the surprised young gentleman. He realised Oliver did not have much experience of the world. "Never mind that. You want some food," he went on. "I haven't got much money, but don't worry, I'll pay." The boy helped Oliver to his feet and took him to a pub. Meat, bread and beer were placed before Oliver, and his new friend urged him to satisfy his hunger. While Oliver was eating, the strange boy looked at him from time to time with great attention. "Going to London?" he asked him finally. "Yes." "Got anywhere to live?" "No." "Money?" "No." The strange boy whistled and put his arms into his pockets as far as the big coat sleeves would allow him. "I suppose you want to sleep somewhere tonight, don't you?" "I do," replied Oliver. "I haven't slept under a roof since I started my journey." "Well, don't worry. I've got to be in London tonight, and I know a very nice old gentleman there who'll let you live in his place and not even ask you for money." Oliver was deeply grateful for this offer of shelter, and talked for a long time with his new friend. His name was Jack Dawkins, but he was usually called the Artful Dodger. Artful because he was very clever at getting what he wanted, and Dodger because he was very good at not getting caught when he did something wrong. When he heard this, Oliver felt rather doubtful about having such a friend. However, he wanted first to meet the kind old gentleman in London who would help him. After that, he could decide whether to continue the friendship with the Artful Dodger. Chapter 4. Oliver in London. For some reason, the Dodger did not want to enter London during daylight, so it was nearly 11 o'clock at night when they got near the centre. Oliver had never seen a dirtier or more miserable place. The streets in this district were narrow and muddy, and there were terrible smells everywhere. Children wandered around even at this time of night, in and out of the many shops, playing and screaming. The pubs were full of people fighting, and big, evil-looking men stood in doorways or at dark corners. Oliver almost wanted to run away, but just then the Dodger pushed open a door and pulled Oliver into a dark hall. "Who's there?" a voice cried out. "It's me," said the Dodger. The faint light of a candle appeared in the hall. "Who's the other one?" "A new friend." They went up some dark and broken stairs. Oliver could hardly see where he was going, but the Dodger seemed to know the way and helped Oliver up. They entered a room with walls that were black with age and dirt. In front of the fire was a table with a candle stuck into a bottle of beer, and an old man with a horribly ugly face and red hair stood next to the fire cooking. He was wearing a dirty old coat and seemed to divide his attention between his cooking and a number of silk handkerchiefs which were hanging near the fire. There were several rough beds in the room. 4 or 5 boys, about the same age as the Artful Dodger, sat round the table smoking and drinking like middle-aged men. They all looked up when the Dodger and Oliver entered. "This is him, Fagin," the Dodger said to the old man. "My friend, Oliver Twist." Fagin smiled and shook Oliver's hand. Then all the young gentlemen came up to him and shook both his hands very hard, especially the hand which held his few possessions. One of the boys was particularly kind. He even put his hands in Oliver's pockets so that Oliver would not have to empty them himself when he went to bed. The boys would probably have been even more helpful, but Fagin hit them on their heads and shoulders until they left Oliver alone. "We are very glad to see you, Oliver," said Fagin. "I see you're staring at the handkerchiefs, my dear. Aren't there a lot? We've just taken them all out to wash them, that's all." This seemed to be a joke, as the old gentleman and all his young friends gave loud shouts of laughter. Then supper began. Oliver ate his share of the food and was then given a glass of gin and water. Fagin told him to drink it fast. Immediately afterwards, Oliver felt himself lifted onto one of the beds and he sank into a deep sleep. When he woke, it was late morning. Fagin was the only other person in the room, and he was boiling coffee in a pan. When the coffee was done, he turned towards Oliver and looked closely at the boy. Oliver was only just awake, and his eyes were half closed, so he seemed to be still fast asleep. Fagin then locked the door, and from a hidden hole in the floor he took out a small box which he placed carefully on the table. His eyes shone as he opened it and took out a gold watch covered in jewels. "Ah," he said to himself, "what fine men they were, loyal to the end. They never told the priest where the jewels were, nor about old Fagin, not even at the very end. And why should they? It was already too late. It wouldn't have stopped the rope going round their necks." Fagin took out at least 6 more watches, as well as rings and bracelets and many other valuable pieces of jewellery. He looked at them with pleasure, then replaced them. "What a good thing hanging is," he murmured. "Dead men can never talk or betray old friends." At that moment he looked up and saw Oliver watching him. He closed the lid of the box with a loud crash and picked up a bread knife from the table. "Why are you watching me? What have you seen? Tell me quick." "I couldn't sleep any longer, sir," said Oliver, terrified. "I'm very sorry." "You weren't awake an hour ago?" Fagin asked fiercely, still holding the knife. "I promise I wasn't, sir," replied Oliver. "Don't worry, my dear," Fagin said, putting down the knife and becoming once again the kind old gentleman. He laughed. "I only tried to frighten you, my dear. You're a brave boy, Oliver. And did you see any of the pretty things?" "Yes, sir." "Ah," said Fagin, turning rather pale. They're mine, Oliver. All I have in my old age." Oliver wondered why the old man lived in such an old, dirty place when he had so many watches, but then he thought that it must cost Fagin a lot of money to look after the Dodger and the other boys. So he said nothing and got up and washed. When he turned towards Fagin, the box had disappeared. Soon the Dodger entered with a cheerful young man named Charley Bates. "Have you been at work this morning?" Fagin asked the Dodger. "Hard at work," answered the Dodger. Good boys, said Fagin. "What have you got?" "A couple of pocket-books and some handkerchiefs." "Good workers, aren't they, Oliver?" said the old man. "Very good," said Oliver. The others all started laughing, though Oliver saw nothing funny in his answer. Fagin inspected the handkerchiefs and told the two boys that they were extremely well made and that he was very pleased with their work. After breakfast, they played a very strange game. The cheerful old man put a watch in his jacket pocket, with a guard chain round his neck and a notebook and a handkerchief in his trouser pocket. Then he went up and down the room, holding a walking stick, just like the old gentleman who walked in the streets. Sometimes he stopped at the fireplace, and sometimes at the door, pretending to stare with great interest into shop windows. He would then constantly look round, as if afraid of thieves, touching all his pockets in such a natural and funny way that Oliver laughed until the tears ran down his face. All the time, the two boys followed Fagin everywhere, and every time he turned round, they moved out of his sight so quickly that it was impossible to follow their movements. Finally, the Dodger bumped into him accidentally from behind, and at that moment both boys took from him very quickly his watch, guard chain, handkerchief, and notebook. If the old man felt a hand in any of his pockets, he cried out, and then the game began again. Later, the boys went out again to do some more work. When they had gone, Fagin turned to Oliver. "Take my advice, my dear," he said. "Make them your models, especially the Dodger. He'll be a great man himself, and will make you one too if you copy him. Is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?"
"Yes, sir," said Oliver.
"See if you can take it out without my feeling it, just as you saw them doing it when we were playing." Oliver held up the bottom of the pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger hold it, and pulled the handkerchief lightly out of it with the other. "Has it gone?" asked Fagin.
"Here it is, sir," said Oliver, showing it in his hand.
"You're a clever boy, my dear," said the old gentleman, putting his hand on Oliver's head. "I've never seen a quicker boy. If you go on like this, you'll be the greatest man in London. Now come here, and I'll show you how to take the marks out of handkerchiefs." Oliver wondered what the connection was between playing at stealing from the old gentleman's pocket and becoming a great man, but he followed him quietly to the table and was soon deeply involved in his new study. Oliver remained in Fagin's room for many days, picking the marks and names out of the handkerchiefs and sometimes playing the same game as before. One evening, 2 young ladies came to visit, and a very cheerful party followed. Oliver thought they were very nice, friendly girls. The Dodger and Charley Bates went out to work every day, but sometimes came home with no handkerchiefs, and Fagin would get very angry. Once he even knocked them both down the stairs and sent them to bed with no dinner because they had returned with nothing. At last, the morning came when Oliver was allowed to go out to work with the 2 other boys. There had been no handkerchiefs for him to work on for several days, and there was not very much to eat for dinner. The 3 boys set out, but they walked so slowly that Oliver thought they were not going to work at all. Then suddenly the Dodger stopped and put his finger to his lips.
"What's the matter?"
demanded Oliver.
"Be quiet," replied the Dodger. "Do you see that old man outside the bookshop? He's the one."
Oliver looked from the Dodger to Charley Bates with great surprise and confusion, but he had been told not to ask questions. The 2 boys walked quickly and secretly across the road towards the old gentleman. Oliver followed behind them, watching in silent amazement. The old gentleman looked quite rich. He wore gold glasses, white trousers, and had an expensive walking stick under his arm. He had picked up a book and was standing there, reading it with great concentration, just as if he were in his own armchair at home. Oliver, his eyes wide with horror and alarm, watched as the Dodger put his hand in the old gentleman's pocket, took out a handkerchief and handed it to Charley Bates. Then the 2 of them ran round the corner as fast as they could. Suddenly, the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and Fagin became clear. Oliver stood for a moment in terror, the blood rushing through him until he felt he was on fire. Then, confused and frightened, he started to run. At the same time, the old gentleman, putting his hand to his pocket and realizing his handkerchief was missing, turned round. He saw Oliver running away, so he naturally thought Oliver was the thief. With loud cries of "Stop, thief!" he ran after Oliver with the book still in his hand. The old gentleman was not the only one who started shouting. The Dodger and Charley Bates, not wanting to attract attention to themselves by running down the street, had stopped round the first corner. When they realized what was happening, they also shouted, "Stop, thief!" and joined in the chase like good citizens. The cry of "Stop, thief!" always causes great excitement. Everybody in the street stopped what they were doing and began to shout themselves. Many joined in the chase with enthusiasm, and soon there was a big crowd running after Oliver.
Finally they caught the exhausted boy. He fell down on the pavement, and the crowd gathered round him. "Is this the boy?" they asked the old gentleman. "Yes," he answered, leaning over Oliver, "but I'm afraid he's hurt himself." "I did that," said a huge young man proudly, "and I hurt my hand doing it." The old gentleman looked at him with an expression of dislike. Oliver lay on the ground, covered with mud and dust and bleeding from the mouth, and looked wildly at all the faces surrounding him. At that moment a policeman arrived and took Oliver by the collar. "Come on, get up," he said roughly. "It wasn't me, sir," said Oliver, looking round. "It was two other boys. They're here somewhere." "Oh, no, they aren't," replied the policeman. In fact, he was right, as the Dodger and Charley had quietly disappeared as soon as the crowd had caught Oliver. "Come on, get up." "Don't hurt him," said the old gentleman. "I won't," said the policeman, tearing Oliver's jacket half off his back as he lifted him up. The three of them started walking, followed by the excited crowd. Chapter 5. Oliver's life changes. Oliver was taken to the nearest police station. The officer at the gate looked at the boy. "Another young thief, eh?" He turned to the old gentleman. "Are you the person who was robbed, sir?" "Yes, I am," replied the old gentleman, "but I'm not sure that this boy actually took the handkerchief. I don't really want to take him to court." "Too late. He must go before the magistrate now." Oliver was locked in a small stone cell which was disgustingly dirty and smelly. As the key turned in the lock, the old gentleman said to himself thoughtfully, "There's something in that boy's face. He could be innocent. Have I seen someone like him before?" After thinking about this for a few minutes, he said, "No, it must be imagination." He sighed unhappily and began reading the book again. Some time later, the officer touched his shoulder and told him that the court was ready. A magistrate was a judge who dealt with small crimes in local courts, and the magistrate for this district was well known. His name was Mr. Fang, and he was a disagreeable, bad-tempered man. Today, he was in a particularly bad mood. He frowned angrily at the old gentleman and asked sharply, "Who are you?" "My name, sir, is Brownlow." "Officer, what is this man charged with?" "He's not charged, sir," answered the officer. "He's accusing the boy." The magistrate looked at Mr. Brownlow from head to foot. "And what have you got to say?" Mr. Brownlow began to explain. "I was standing outside a bookshop—" "Be quiet, sir," shouted Mr. Fang. "Policeman, now, you arrested the boy. What happened?" The policeman told the magistrate what he had heard and how he had searched Oliver afterwards and found nothing. "Are there any witnesses?" asked the magistrate. "None," answered the policeman. Mr. Fang then turned to Mr. Brownlow and angrily told him to describe what had happened. Mr. Brownlow explained that he had run after the boy only because he saw him running away. He did not think that the boy was the actual thief, and he hoped that the boy would not be punished. "He's been hurt already," he added, "and now I'm afraid he's very ill." "I don't believe that for a moment," said Mr. Fang unpleasantly. He turned to Oliver. "Come now, don't try any clever tricks with me. What's your name?" he demanded. Oliver tried to reply, but he was too weak to speak. He was deadly pale, and he felt the room spinning round him. At last he managed to whisper a request for water, but the magistrate refused angrily. Suddenly, Oliver fainted and fell to the floor. Mr. Fang stared at him angrily. "Guilty, 3 months' prison," he said immediately. "Let him lie there. He'll soon be tired of that." Mr. Fang stood up. "This court is now closed." At that moment, a man in an old black coat rushed in. "Stop!" he shouted. "Don't take the boy away. I saw it all. I'm the bookshop owner." Mr. Fang's face was black with anger at this unexpected interruption, but the bookshop owner demanded to be heard. He described exactly what had really happened. he had seen 2 boys steal the handkerchief and then run away, leaving Oliver to be arrested. In a final burst of bad temper, Mr. Fang said that his time had been wasted. He announced that Oliver was innocent and ordered everybody out of the court. The order was obeyed, and as Mr. Brownlow turned to go down the street, he saw Oliver lying on the pavement, shaking, his face as white as death. "Poor boy, said Mr. Brownlow, bending over him. He called a coach quickly, laid Oliver on the seat, and drove away. The coach stopped at a neat house in a quiet, shady street in North London. Oliver was gently carried into a bed and received more care and kindness than he had ever had in his life. But he had a fever, and for many days he lay there unconscious. When he eventually awoke, weak, thin and pale, he looked anxiously around the room. "What room is this? Where am I?" he said. "This is not the place I fell asleep in." Mrs. Bedwin, the motherly old housekeeper, heard his words and instantly came to him. "Hush! Be quiet, my dear, or you'll be ill again. Lie down." He lay down and woke up again much later. After a while, he was able to sit up in a chair, although he was still too weak to walk. In this new position, he could see a picture of a woman hanging on the wall opposite. "Who is that, madam?" he asked the old housekeeper. "I don't know, my dear. Do you like it?" "The eyes look so sad, and they seem to be staring at me, as if the person was alive and wanted to speak to me but couldn't." "You're weak and nervous after your illness," Mrs. Bedwin said kindly. "Don't worry about things like that." Later that day, Mr. Brownlow came in, having heard that the boy was a little better at last. He was delighted to see that Oliver could sit up, but when he saw Oliver's face clearly, Mr. Brownlow stared hard at him. "I hope you're not angry with me, sir," said Oliver anxiously. "No, not in the least," he replied. Then he turned to the housekeeper. "But look, Mrs. Bedwin, look there." He pointed to the picture of the woman above Oliver's head, and then to the boy's face. It was a living copy of the picture. Even the expression was the same. Oliver did not understand what was happening. He was so alarmed by Mr. Brownlow's excitement that he fainted once more. The Dodger and Charley Bates had left the crowd which was chasing Oliver as soon as they could. They went back to their house through the narrow streets, using a complicated route in case anyone was following them. Once they were safely away from other people, Charley Bates rolled on the ground and laughed and laughed. "When I saw Oliver running away so fast round all the corners, bumping into walls, and all the time I had the handkerchief in my pocket." "But what will Fagin say?" asked the Dodger. "What do you mean?" The Dodger said nothing more, but led Charley Bates into the house and up the stairs. When Fagin saw them enter, he rose to his feet. "Where's Oliver?" he asked them furiously. The 2 boys looked uneasily at each other, but said nothing. Fagin took hold of the Dodger's collar and shook him violently. "Tell me, or I'll kill you." The Dodger slid out of his coat in one smooth movement, leaving Fagin holding only the empty coat. "The police have got him," he said reluctantly. He looked round for a weapon to fight with, but Fagin already had a heavy metal pot in his hand. He threw it hard at the Dodger, but missed and hit Charley Bates, who started to shout with fear. Suddenly, all this noise and confusion was silenced by a deep voice at the door. "What the devil's going on here?" the voice demanded. The owner of the voice was a big man of about 35 in a black coat and very dirty trousers, with a brown hat on his head and a dirty handkerchief around his neck. He also had a 3-day-old beard. A white dog with torn ears followed him into the room. The man kicked the dog into a corner and looked round at the signs of battle. "Are they trying to murder you, Fagin? I would if I was them. I'd have done it long ago. Now give me some beer and don't poison it." It was said as a joke, but if the man had seen the evil look on Fagin's face, he might have thought the warning was a necessary one. Fagin produced some beer, and as the fight appeared to be over, everybody sat down. In the conversation that followed, Fagin told the newcomer that Oliver had been caught by the police. "I'm afraid, Mr. Sykes," he said, "the boy may say something which will get us into trouble." "Very likely," said Bill Sykes, smiling unkindly. "You've got problems, Fagin." "And I'm afraid," added Fagin, ignoring Sykes's remark, "that if we're in trouble, then a lot of other people will be in trouble too, if you understand me, my dear." Sykes turned angrily towards the old man. There was a silence. Then Sykes said, "Somebody must find out what's happened. If he hasn't said anything yet, we must catch him when he leaves the police station." Fagin nodded. But there was a difficulty. None of them wanted to go anywhere near a police station. The problem was solved with the arrival of the two young ladies whom Oliver had met one evening in Fagin's house. "Nancy, my dear," Fagin said. He smiled sweetly at one of the young ladies. "Can you go to find out what's happened to Oliver?" The young lady answered calmly, "No, I won't." "You're the only one here that the police in this district don't know," said Sykes. "She'll go, Fagin." "No," repeated Nancy. "Yes, she will, Fagin." Sykes was right. With a mixture of threats and promises, he soon persuaded Nancy to go. She set off at once, and at the police station pretended to be a shy, frightened girl. "Is my poor little brother Oliver here?" she asked the officer with the keys. "He's not here," the officer replied. "The gentleman's got him." "The gentleman? Oh, no! What gentleman?" cried Nancy, very upset. The policeman explained that Oliver had become ill, and the old gentleman had taken him to his house in the Pentonville district of North London. Nancy, still looking terribly upset, left the station and hurried back to Fagin's house with this news. As soon as he heard it, Sykes called his white dog, put on his hat, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. "We must find him," Fagin said urgently to the rest of them. "No one can stay here. It's too dangerous now. All of you, walk around Pentonville and keep your ears open. Don't come back until you have some news of Oliver. If you can, kidnap him. We've got to keep him quiet before he starts talking about us to his new friends." With these words, he pushed them all from his room and double-locked the door behind them. Then he took out his hidden box and very carefully hid all the watches and the jewellery beneath his clothes. Chapter 6. Oliver is found again. Oliver began to recover and slowly regain his strength. The picture that had caused Mr. Brownlow's excitement was taken down from the wall and was not mentioned again. Oliver was disappointed at the disappearance of the picture, since he liked the woman's face, but he had many other things to think about now. They were happy days while Oliver was getting better. He played cards with Mrs. Bedwin and listened to stories about her family. The days were all so quiet and relaxing after the hardships and poverty of his previous life. Mr. Brownlow bought him a new suit and new shoes, and Oliver's dirty old clothes were given away. One day, Mr. Brownlow asked him to come to his study for a little talk. Oliver went in and sat down. He looked at Mr. Brownlow's serious face in alarm. "Don't tell me you're going to send me away, sir, please," he exclaimed. "Let me stay here. I could help with the housework. Please, sir." "My dear child, don't be afraid," said Mr. Brownlow kindly. "I won't desert you. I believe that you're a good boy, not a common thief. You told me you're an orphan. That seems to be the truth. But I want to hear now the whole story of your life, and how you came to be with the boys I saw you with that day. Oliver began his story, but was soon interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Grimwig, an old friend of Mr. Brownlow's. Mr. Grimwig was a fierce old gentleman and very fond of arguments. He clearly knew all about Oliver and inspected him closely. "So this is the boy, is it?" he said at last. Oliver bowed politely and was introduced by Mr. Brownlow. Tea was then brought in, and during the meal Mr. Grimwig stared so hard at Oliver that the boy felt rather confused. Eventually, Mr. Grimwig whispered to Mr. Brownlow, "He may be a good-looking boy, but I think he's deceiving you, my good friend." "Nonsense," said Mr. Brownlow, becoming angry. "Well, we'll see," answered his friend. "We'll see." Later that afternoon, Mr. Brownlow wanted to return some books to a bookseller and to send some money for new books that he had already collected. Mr. Grimwig suggested that Oliver should go. "He'll be sure to deliver everything safely," he said with a smile. "Yes, please let me take them," said Oliver, delighted to be of use. Mr. Brownlow hesitated, but Mr. Grimwig's smile had annoyed him. "Very well," he said. "Here are the books, Oliver, and a £5 note. The bookseller will give you 10 shillings change." "I won't be 10 minutes," replied Oliver eagerly, and he ran out into the street. "So you expect him to come back, do you?" inquired Mr. Grimwig. "Yes, I do," said Mr. Brownlow, smiling confidently. "Don't you?" "No. He has a new suit of clothes, some valuable books, and a £5 note in his pocket. He'll join his old friends the thieves and laugh at you. If he comes back, I'll eat my hat." The two men sat by the window with a pocket watch between them and waited for Oliver's return. Oliver hurried through the streets to the bookshop, thinking how lucky he was. Suddenly, there was a loud scream behind him. "Oh, my dear brother!" Before he could look round, a pair of arms was thrown tightly around his neck. "Don't!" he cried, struggling. "Let go! Why are you stopping me? Who is it?" The young woman holding him started to cry loudly. "I've found him! Oh, Oliver, you naughty boy, to make me suffer so much! Come home immediately, you cruel boy!" She burst into tears, and several people stopped to stare at what was happening. "What's the matter?" asked one of the watching women. "He ran away from his parents a month ago," the young woman said. "They're hard-working, respectable people, and he left them to join a gang of thieves and bad characters and almost broke his mother's heart." "Go home, you horrible child," said another woman. "Yes, go back to your parents," said a third. "But I haven't got any," replied Oliver, greatly alarmed. "I haven't got a sister either. I'm an orphan. I live in Pentonville." "Listen to him. Make him come home," the young woman said to the crowd, "or you kill his dear mother and father and break my heart." Suddenly, Oliver recognised the woman he had seen in Fagin's house. "It's Nancy," he said without thinking. "You see," cried Nancy to the crowd, "he knows me." Just then a big man ran out of a beer shop, followed by a white dog. "What's this, young Oliver? Come home to your poor mother, you young devil. And what books are these? You've stolen them, haven't you? Give them to me." The man, who was Bill Sikes, seized Oliver with one strong hand and hit him on the head with the other. "That'll do him good," shouted some of the crowd. "It's the only way to treat boys like him." Bill Sikes held onto Oliver's arm. "Come on, you young thief." Still weak from illness and terrified by the growling dog, Oliver could not resist. He was taken through the dark, narrow streets at great speed. Sikes and Nancy gave him no chance to escape, and Oliver had no breath to call out for help. All too quickly, he was back in Fagin's house, where his old friends were waiting for him. "Delighted to see you looking so well, my dear," Fagin said, bowing politely. "Why didn't you write and say you were coming? We'd have got something warm for supper." The Dodger and Charley Bates roared with laughter, and the Dodger began looking through the books Oliver had with him. "Give them back," Oliver cried. "Those books belong to the kind old gentleman who took me into his home. Send him back the books and the money. He'll think I stole them."
"You're right," laughed Fagin. "He will think that."
Oliver jumped to his feet and ran wildly from the room, shouting for help. The Dodger and Fagin caught him easily and brought him back. Then the old man picked up a long piece of wood.
"So you wanted to get away, my dear, did you? Wanted to call the police and get help? We'll cure you of that."
He hit Oliver hard on the shoulders with the stick. He was raising it for a second hit when Nancy rushed forward and, seizing the piece of wood, threw it into the fire. "I won't let you do it, Fagin," she shouted. "You've got him again, isn't that enough? Now leave him alone." Fagin and Sykes looked at each other, shocked by her reaction.
"You better keep quiet, my girl," growled Sykes.
"No, I won't," cried the girl wildly. "Now you've got the boy, you'll turn him into a thief and a liar. Isn't that enough without killing him too?" She rushed at Fagin and would have hit him if Sykes had not held her arms so tightly that she couldn't move. She struggled wildly for a while, then, exhausted, she fainted. Sykes laid her down in the corner, as surprised as Fagin at her anger.
"She can be really wild when she's angry," Sykes said.
Fagin wiped his forehead.
"That's the trouble with women," he said. "But she's a clever girl in her work."
Then Charley Bates and the Dodger took away Oliver's expensive new suit, gave him some old clothes, and locked him up in a dark room. Oliver felt tired and ill, and was soon fast asleep. Chapter 7. The Robbery. A few days later, a visitor arrived in London from Oliver's hometown. He was a large, fat man, and very proud of his hat, which showed the world that he was a most important official. It was, in fact, Mr. Bumble the Beadle, Oliver's old enemy. Mr. Bumble had completed his business in the city and had just finished a most satisfactory meal in a pub. He pulled up his chair to the fire to enjoy his hot gin and water in comfort and opened the newspaper. The first thing he saw was this notice. "A reward of £5 is offered for any information leading to the discovery of a young boy, Oliver Twist, who was kidnapped from his home in Pentonville last Thursday evening. I am also very interested in any information about his past." There was then a full description of Oliver's clothes and appearance, and Mr. Brownlow's full address. Mr. Bumble rubbed his eyes, read the notice again, and was at the address in less than 10 minutes. He was shown into Mr. Brownlow's study, where the old gentleman and his friend Mr. Grimwig were sitting.
"Do you know where the poor boy is now?"
Mr. Brownlow asked when the Beadle had explained the reason for his visit. Mr. Bumble shook his head.
"Do you know anything good about him?"
asked Mr. Grimwig, looking closely at Mr. Bumble's face. Mr. Bumble shook his head again, very seriously, and turned down the corners of his mouth.
"Then tell us everything you know about him," said Mr. Brownlow impatiently.
Mr. Bumble put down his hat, unbuttoned his coat, folded his arms, and sat back in his chair. He spoke in his most important and official voice, and talked for 20 minutes. His listeners heard all the details of Oliver's illegitimate birth, and how generously he had been treated as a workhouse orphan. They heard how he had always been an ungrateful and dangerous child, violently attacking another boy, and finally running away from the house where he had been working. The old gentleman shook his head sadly and gave Mr. Bumble the £5.
"I would have been happy to give you 3 times the amount if your story had proved that the boy was good."
If Mr. Bumble had known this earlier, he might have told a different story, but now it was too late, so he took the money and left. Mr. Brownlow walked up and down his room for several minutes, deep in thought. He rang the bell for Mrs. Bedwin, his housekeeper, and told her what he had heard. "I don't believe it," she said with great certainty. "I was right," said Mr. Grimwig with satisfaction. "You should have listened to what I said." Mr. Brownlow said angrily, "Never let me hear the boy's name again. Never. Remember that, Mrs. Bedwin." There were sad hearts at Mr. Brownlow's house that night. Meanwhile, in another part of London, Oliver remained a prisoner. Fagin had told Oliver how ungrateful he had been to run away. He had told him that he would have died of hunger without Fagin's kindness. He went on to tell Oliver the story of another young boy who had gone to the police to tell them about the gang, but who had finally been hanged one morning for being a thief. Fagin described the hanging in terrifying detail, and said that he hoped he would never have to tell the police about Oliver, and see Oliver with a rope around his neck. Oliver felt his blood turn cold. He remained locked in a room for many days, seeing nobody between early morning and midnight. He spent his time thinking sadly about his friends in Pentonville. After a week, he was free to wander round the house during the day. It was a dirty place, full of rats and insects, but no other living thing. All the windows were closed and covered with wood and metal bars that kept out the light. One afternoon, the Dodger and Charley Bates were at home, and they started telling Oliver about their lives as thieves. "Why don't you become one?" Charley asked him. "We all are here. Both of us, and Fagin, Sykes, Nancy, all of us." "I don't want to be," replied Oliver. "I wish they'd let me go." "But it's a good life," the Dodger said, taking some coins from his pocket and throwing them up in the air. "What does it matter where the money comes from?" he said, laughing. "If you don't steal it, someone else will. You can be sure of that." Fagin entered at this point with two young men and joined in the conversation. One of the young men had just come out of prison, and there were many cheerful jokes about his very short haircut. Everybody sat around the fire, talking and laughing for hours. Fagin told Oliver how good the Dodger was at his job, and what a friendly boy Charley was. It was, without doubt, an interesting evening for Oliver, after so many days locked up alone. After that evening he was rarely on his own again. He spent a lot of time with the Dodger and Charley, and often played the handkerchief game with them. At other times, Fagin would tell them all about robberies he had committed in his younger days, telling the stories so well and putting in so many funny details that Oliver could not stop laughing, even though he knew it was wrong. Fagin knew what he was doing. He had made sure that Oliver was so lonely and miserable that he would be desperate for any friends, however criminal. Slowly and deliberately, Fagin was trying to poison the young boy's mind. One damp, cold, windy night a few weeks later, Fagin put on his heavy coat and, with the collar pulled up high to hide his face, left his home. He walked fast through the streets, never losing his way even in the darkest places. Finally, he reached an evil, narrow street lit only by a single lamp. He knocked on a door, said something quietly to the person who opened it, then walked upstairs. Bill Sykes was sitting by his fire with his dog when Fagin entered. The room was a small, dark place with almost no furniture. Nancy was there too, and Fagin glanced at her uneasily. He had not seen her since she had attacked him to stop him hitting Oliver. However, she seemed to have forgotten all about it because she told him to pull up a chair and warm himself by the fire.
"I'm ready for business,"
Bill Sykes said, looking at Fagin suspiciously.
"Say what you have to say, Fagin." "It's about the robbery at Chertsey, Bill," answered Fagin. "Some lovely silver in that house down there." I know, Sykes said. "I was down there 2 nights ago to have a look at the house. But it's locked like a prison at night, all except one part." "Where's that?" asked Fagin, bending his head forwards, his eyes staring excitedly at Sykes. "Do you think I'm stupid? I'm not telling you. Anyway, what we need is a boy." "So there's a small place where only a boy can enter the house?" asked Fagin. "Maybe, but we need a boy."
There was silence for a time while Fagin thought. Then he made a sign to Sykes to tell Nancy to leave the room.
"Don't worry," Sykes said. "You can trust her. She won't talk. Isn't that right?"
"Of course it's right," answered the young woman, taking a large drink from the bottle on the table and laughing. "Anyway, Fagin, I know your idea is for Oliver to do the job."
"You're a clever girl," said Fagin, smiling evilly. "That's exactly what I had in mind. Listen, Bill. The boy's been training for a few weeks, and it's time he did some work. He's the smallest one, anyway." "Is he safe?" asked Sykes. "Because if he tries any tricks on me, I'll kill him." "He'll be ours for life if he feels he's one of us, and this job will make him feel like that," said Fagin eagerly. "The boy looks so innocent, he's perfect. And we've got to include him in some crime as soon as we can. Otherwise, if he escapes now, he can tell the police about us and stay free himself." So it was decided that Oliver would help Sykes with the robbery in 2 days' time. The plan was discussed in great detail and all the arrangements made. By then, Sykes was very drunk, and Fagin got up to leave. As he put on his coat, he stared hard at Nancy, frowning a little. No, he was sure he could trust her. She was loyal. The next night, Oliver was alone in Fagin's house when Nancy entered. She was so nervous and white-faced that Oliver asked her if she was ill. "God forgive me," she said, beating her hands together. "I never thought I would do this." "Has anything happened?" asked the boy. "What is it?" She sat with her back to him and hid her face with her hands. After a while she said, "I don't know why I feel so strange sometimes. Come on, Oliver, are you ready? You have to come with me to Bill's house." "Why?" "Oh, nothing important." Oliver did not believe her, but he thought that at last this might be an opportunity to escape, so he said rather too quickly, "I'm ready." Nancy guessed what he was thinking. "Oliver," she said, "this is not the time to escape. I've saved you once and I will again, but if anything happens tonight, it might mean my death." She said this so seriously that Oliver decided it must be true. He was quiet while they walked quickly through the streets to Sykes' house. Inside his room, Sykes sat Oliver down on a chair. "Did he come quietly?" he asked Nancy. "Quiet as a mouse." "Glad to hear it," said Sykes. "Now listen to me, boy." He put a gun against Oliver's head. "If you say one word when you're outside with me, I'll shoot you. Understand?" Oliver nodded, trying hard not to tremble. Sykes and Oliver started out at 5 o'clock in the morning, while it was still dark. They crossed from one side of London to the other. At first the streets were empty, then shops began to open and people started going to work. Gradually the noise and traffic increased, and as they passed through the meat market at Smithfield, Oliver was amazed by the sight and smells of so many animals and by the huge crowds of people, all pushing and swearing and shouting. But Bill Sykes marched on without stopping. Later in the day, they were given a lift in a horse and cart from West London out into the country. Night fell, and after walking a few more miles down country roads, they finally arrived at an old house standing alone by a river. It was dark and seemed to be empty. They went inside without knocking. Inside were 2 other men, who at Sykes' command produced food and drink for him and the boy. Then Sykes told Oliver to get some sleep, as they would be going out again later that night. Oliver still had no idea of the purpose of this expedition, but his head ached with tiredness and he soon fell asleep. At 1:30, the men got up and checked their equipment, gathering several sticks as well. Sykes and the man called Toby left the house together, with Oliver walking between them. There was now a thick fog, and the night was very still as they hurried through the deserted streets of the nearby town. Out in the country again, they walked down several small roads
until finally they stopped at a house surrounded by a high wall. As quick as lightning, Toby climbed up and pulled Oliver after him. Inside the garden, they crept towards the house, and now, for the first time, Oliver realized in horror that the purpose of the expedition was robbery and maybe even murder. Bill Sikes broke open a small window at the back of the house, then shone his light into Oliver's face. "Now listen. I'm going to put you through here. Go straight through into the hall and onto the front door and let us in. And if you don't, you can be sure I'll shoot you." Oliver, stupid with terror, was lifted through the window into the house. Desperately, he decided to try to run upstairs and warn the family. He began to creep forwards. Suddenly, there was a loud noise from the hall. "Come back!" shouted Sikes. "Back! Back!" Oliver stood still, frozen with fear. A light appeared, then 2 men on the stairs, then a sudden bright flash and a loud bang. Oliver staggered back. Sikes seized the boy's collar through the window and pulled him back out into the garden. "They've hit him!" shouted Sikes. "He's bleeding!" A bell rang loudly, above the noise of more gunshots and the shouts of men. Oliver felt himself being carried across rough ground, and then he saw and heard no more. Chapter 8. After the Robbery. The night was bitterly cold. A sharp wind whipped the fallen snow up into the air and blew it into every hole and corner. It was a night for the homeless to lie down and die, and for luckier people to sit close to their fires and thank God they were at home. In the workhouse where Oliver was born, Mrs. Corney, the widow in charge, was making tea by her fire. When she heard a knock at her door, she frowned and called out sharply, "Come in." The frown, however, was quickly changed to a sweet smile when she saw Mr. Bumble enter. "Hard weather, Mr. Bumble," said the widow. "Yes, indeed, ma'am," replied the beadle. "We've had to give out to the poor people in this town great quantities of bread and cheese today, and they're still complaining. Why, one man even came back and demanded some free firewood. What does he want that for? People are never satisfied. Give them one thing today, and tomorrow they'll ask for something else." Mrs. Corney agreed that it was very shocking. They discussed some workhouse business together, and then Mr. Bumble looked hopefully at the teapot. Mrs. Corney offered him some tea. Instantly, Mr. Bumble sat down by the fire and gave the widow such a warm smile that her face turned a delicate pink. She passed Mr. Bumble the teacup, and as he took it, he managed to give her hand a little stroke. "You're a kind-hearted woman, Mrs. Corney," said the beadle. "Oh, Mr. Bumble," said the widow, smiling shyly. For a while there was a friendly silence between them. Then Mr. Bumble moved his chair closer to the widow's. Mrs. Corney, of course, did not notice this, but when the beadle's arm began to slide around her waist, she felt she must make a small protest. Encouraged by this response, Mr. Bumble immediately gave her a kiss, but at this interesting moment there was a sudden knock at the door. Mr. Bumble jumped to his feet and went to the other end of the room. "Please, Mrs. Corney," said a voice outside. "Old Sally's going fast." "Well, what can I do to help her?" asked Mrs. Corney angrily. "Nothing, ma'am," replied the old woman outside, "but she says she has something to tell you, which you must hear. She won't die quietly till you come." Complaining loudly, Mrs. Corney asked Mr. Bumble to wait until she came back. Then she followed the old woman up the stairs. Old Sally lay in bed in a freezing cold room. The fire was so small and mean that it gave no warmth at all. Mrs. Corney bent over the bed, and the dying woman opened her eyes. "Come closer," she murmured. "Let me whisper in your ear." She held on to Mrs. Corney's arm and pulled her down towards her. "In this same room, I once helped a pretty young woman
who came in with cut and bleeding feet, who gave birth to a boy and then died."
"Well?" asked Mrs. Corney impatiently.
"I robbed her. She was hardly dead before I stole it."
"Stole what?"
"It. The only thing she had. It was gold. It could have saved her life."
"Gold? Who was this mother? Tell me."
"She told me to look after it when she died." The old woman's mind was getting confused. "She trusted me, poor girl, and I stole it."
"Quick, tell me, or it may be too late," said Mrs. Corney greedily. "What was it, and what was the boy's name?" The old woman could hardly speak.
"Oliver. The gold I stole was—"
Yes, what?" The old woman fell back onto the bed, dead. Mrs. Corney hurried back to her room, where Mr. Bumble was still admiring her furniture and counting her silver teaspoons. They sat down again by the fire, and soon Mr. Bumble's arm returned to its previous position round Mrs. Corney's waist. It was not long before he asked her to marry him, and the widow happily accepted him. While they drank to celebrate the arrangement, Mrs. Corney told Mr. Bumble about old Sally's death and the unknown gold object which she had stolen from the dead body of the young woman. After many expressions of undying love, Mr. Bumble finally left the room and returned home, with bright visions of his future. While these events were happening in the workhouse, the Artful Dodger and Charley Bates were playing cards in Fagin's house. The Dodger, as usual, was winning easily. Somehow he always seemed to know exactly what cards the other players had in their hands. Suddenly there was a faint ring on the bell downstairs, and Toby came in, the man who had gone with Bill Sikes and Oliver to rob the house in Chertsey. Fagin jumped to his feet.
"Where are they?" he screamed. "Sikes and the boy, where are they hiding?"
"We failed," said the robber.
"What happened?"
"They fired and hit the boy. We ran away with Oliver between us, and they chased us with dogs."
"And the boy? What about the boy?"
gasped Fagin. "His head was hanging down and he was cold. We needed to go faster, so we left him in a field, alive or dead. That's all I know about him." Fagin did not wait to hear any more. He gave an angry scream, ran out of the house, and hurried through the streets until he reached Bill Sikes' house. As he climbed the stairs, he thought,
"Well, Nancy, if there's anything going on here, I'll find out about it, however clever you are."
Nancy was alone upstairs in her room, her head on the table.
"She's been drinking again," thought Fagin.
As he closed the door, she woke up. He told her what had happened during the robbery. She said nothing, and her head returned to the table.
"And where do you think the boy is now, my dear?"
Fagin asked her, trying hard to see her face.
"Poor little child, left alone like that."
Nancy looked up.
"I hope the child's dead. Then he'd be happier than any of us." "What?" said Fagin in amazement. "It's better like that. The sight of the boy turns me against myself and all of you." "You're drunk." Fagin suddenly lost his temper. "The boy's worth a fortune to me, and now a drunken gang has lost him. And if Sikes doesn't return that boy to me, dead or alive, I'll tell the police about him, and I'll get Sikes hanged. Just remember that."
When Fagin left her, Nancy was already back in a drunken sleep, her head lying on the table once more. Fagin went out into the blackness of the night and walked home. He had reached the corner of his street and was searching in his pocket for his key when a dark figure came out of the shadows and crossed the road towards him. "I've been waiting here for 2 hours, Fagin," said the stranger. "Where have you been?"
"On your business, my dear," said Fagin, glancing at him uneasily.
"We'd better talk inside." The door closed behind them, and they crept quietly up to the top floor in order not to wake the sleeping boys downstairs. They sat in a dark room, the only light coming from a candle burning in the passage outside. The stranger's name was Monks, and he was in an evil mood. He listened to Fagin for a while, frowning heavily. "It was badly planned," he said angrily. "Couldn't you have made the boy into an ordinary thief and then got him arrested and sent out of the country for the rest of his life?"
"But he isn't like the other boys here," Fagin said. "I had nothing to frighten him with. Anyway, I've already helped you. After he was caught by the police stealing from the bookshop, I got Nancy to get him back, and then she felt sorry for him."
"Killer," Monks said impatiently.
"We can't afford to do that kind of thing," said Fagin. "But I can turn the boy into an ordinary thief now, and then Nancy will harden her heart against him. I know how women are. But if he's already dead—"
"That's not my fault," said Monks quickly. "I always said to you, do anything you want to him, but don't kill him. I wouldn't have been able to forget it if you had." Suddenly he jumped to his feet, staring at the wall opposite the door.
"What's that?" he whispered, terrified.
"What?
Where?" cried Fagin. "The shadow. I saw the shadow of a woman pass along that wall."
White-faced, they both ran from the room into the passage. The candle threw long shadows down the stairs, but there was no one there. They listened. Only silence filled the house.
"It was your imagination," said Fagin softly. "I swear I saw it," replied Monks.
They searched all the upstairs rooms. They were empty and as quiet as death. Monks grew calmer and eventually left the house at 1 o'clock in the morning. The chase down at Chertsey the previous night had not lasted long. There was a lot of noise of men shouting and dogs barking as the servants from the house pursued the robbers across the fields. But Sykes and Toby wasted no time. They dropped Oliver's unconscious body in a field and disappeared into the fog and the darkness in different directions. The three pursuers lost enthusiasm for the chase and agreed among themselves that it was much too dangerous to continue. They returned to the house, keeping close together and trying to look brave. Morning came, but Oliver still lay in the field as if dead. It began to rain heavily, and after a while Oliver opened his eyes. His left arm was covered in blood and hurting badly. He felt so weak he could hardly stand, but he knew that if he stayed where he was, he would die. Gasping with pain, he forced himself to his feet and with slow, shaky steps began to walk. He had no idea where he was going, and moved forward mechanically, as though in a dream. After a while his feet found a road, and he looked round and saw a house in the distance. He decided he would rather die near human beings than in a cold field, so he turned his steps towards the house. As he came nearer, he realized that the house was familiar, and he felt faint with terror. But where else could he go? With a last effort, he crawled up the path and knocked on the door, then fell exhausted on the step. It was now mid-morning. Inside the house, the men servants were still describing the night's adventures to the cook and the servant girl, who gasped with appreciative horror at every exciting moment. They were all enjoying themselves very much, when there came a knock at the door. Pale with fright, they all stared at each other. Nobody was keen to answer the knock, so eventually they all went, including the dogs. Very cautiously they opened the door and saw nothing more alarming than poor Oliver curled up in a sad little heap on the step. Then one of the men gave a shout, seized the boy by a leg and pulled him into the hall. "Here he is," he cried excitedly. "Here's the thief. I shot him last night." A young lady appeared at the top of the stairs. "What's going on here? Quiet, please. Is this poor boy very hurt?" "Very," said the servant, proudly. "Then one of you go to town as fast as you can and fetch a policeman and Dr. Losberne. The rest of you help to carry the boy upstairs and put him to bed. Treat him kindly, I beg you." Chapter 9. Oliver starts another life. In a comfortable, pleasant sitting room, The two ladies of the house waited anxiously for the doctor and the police to arrive. The owner of the house, Mrs. Maylie, was an older woman, but her niece, Rose, was a girl of 17 whose quiet beauty and gentle charm won all hearts. As soon as the doctor arrived, he ran breathlessly into the house and burst into the room without knocking. He was clearly a good friend of the ladies. "I never heard of such a dreadful thing. You should both be dead of fright," he said to Mrs. Maylie. "In the silence of the night, too. Are you both all right? Why didn't you send for me at once?" "We are quite all right," said Rose, smiling. "But there's an injured boy upstairs whom Aunt wants you to see." Dr. Losberne went up to examine Oliver and was there for some time. He came down looking rather puzzled and asked the two ladies to see the boy with him. "I can promise you there's nothing very frightening about him," he said. Instead of the evil-looking robber they expected to see, the two ladies found only a pale, thin child lying peacefully asleep. He looked so innocent that Mrs. Maylie said, "This child could never have been in a gang of robbers." "It certainly seems strange," agreed the doctor, "but wickedness can hide behind the most gentle face, you know." "But he's so young, too," cried Rose. "Can you really believe this poor boy is a criminal? Oh, Dr. Losberne and my dear aunt, I beg you both to have pity on him." Mrs. Maylie did not need persuading, and the doctor could not resist Rose's tears. He had, in fact, an extremely kind heart, which he tried to hide behind a quick, fierce manner, though this usually deceived no one. "Well, what's to be done, then?" he said quickly. "We'll have the police here at any moment, ready to take the boy away and throw him into prison." Rose begged him to think of a plan, and the doctor thought hard for a few minutes, frowning fiercely. At last he said, "I've got it," and rubbed his hands together in satisfaction. A little later, Oliver woke up and was very anxious to tell his story, although he had lost a lot of blood and was very weak. When the doctor and the ladies had heard all about his sad life, they were quite sure that they wanted to save Oliver from any unfair punishment. So Dr. Losberne went down to the kitchen to talk to the 3 servants who had surprised Sikes and Oliver during the robbery. The doctor folded his arms and gave the men a long, hard stare. "Tell me," he began, "can you be absolutely sure that the boy upstairs is the same one that was in the house last night? Well?" The doctor, usually such a friendly man, seemed so angry that the servants stared at him open-mouthed. The doctor gave them no time to think and went on fiercely, "3 men see a boy for about a second in the dark in the middle of a lot of smoke and noise. A boy comes to the same house the next day, and because one arm is injured, they think he must be the robber. Are you going to swear that this is the same boy? Well, what do you say?" he finished impatiently. The servants looked at each other in great confusion. Suddenly there was a ring at the gate. The police officers had finally arrived. Dr. Losberne gave orders that plenty of beer should be served before the officers went up to see Oliver. He also made sure that the servants had a generous amount of beer too. When the officers were finally allowed to see Oliver, Dr. Losberne said, "This is a boy who was shot this morning while walking on a farmer's property where he shouldn't have been. The servants saw him and immediately thought he must be the same boy from last night. But now they say they're sure it's not the same boy." The servants were by now so confused by beer and excitement that they were not sure of anything at all. The robbers had certainly had a boy with them, they said, but whether this boy was the same boy, well, it seemed very doubtful. The police, too, had drunk quite a lot of beer by now, and before long they were very willing to believe that Oliver was not the robber of the night before. They had their own ideas about who committed all the robberies in the area, and Oliver was unknown to them. At last the police left, and Oliver was allowed to recover in the kind care of Mrs. Maylie, Rose, and Dr. Losberne. It was several weeks before he was well enough to get out of bed, but then he quickly grew stronger, and every day told his rescuers how grateful he was. One thing, however, caused him unhappiness. He wanted to find Mr. Brownlow, the kind old man who had looked after him in London.
"Mr. Brownlow would be pleased to know how happy I am now," he said.
So when Dr. Losberne offered to take Oliver to London to see Mr. Brownlow, the boy was very pleased. They set out by coach one fine morning, and when they arrived in London, they went straight to Mr. Brownlow's house. Oliver's heart beat with excitement as they stopped outside. But the house was empty. They were told by the people next door that Mr. Brownlow had moved to the West Indies 6 weeks before. Oliver was very disappointed. He had thought about Mr. Brownlow so much recently, and had always hoped to find him again. But now the kind old man had moved abroad, still believing Oliver was a lying thief, and he might hold this belief until the day he died. This was a bitter disappointment to Oliver, but his new friends were still as kind to him as ever. They left the house in Chertsey and moved to a quiet cottage in the country, taking Oliver with them. Spring came, and in the fresh air, away from the noise and smoke and trouble of the city, Oliver began a new life. He went for walks with Rose and Mrs. Maylie, or Rose read to him, and he worked hard at his lessons. He felt as if he had left behind forever the world of crime and hardship and poverty. Chapter 10. Life in the Country. The weeks slipped contentedly past, and spring turned into summer. Oliver was now a strong and healthy boy, and very fond of Rose and Mrs. Maylie, as they were of him. One hot summer evening, after a walk in the country, Rose became very weak and pale, and confessed she felt ill. By the next morning she was in a dangerous fever, and Mrs. Maylie and Oliver were afraid she might die. Mrs. Maylie sent Oliver to the nearest town, 4 miles away, to post 2 express letters. One was to Dr. Losberne in Chertsey, the other to Harry Maylie, Mrs. Maylie's son. Oliver, filled with anxiety, ran as fast as he could along the country roads and across the fields until, hot and exhausted, he reached the town. He posted the letters and turned to hurry home again. As he was running past a pub in the main street, he accidentally bumped into a tall man in black coming out. The man stared at Oliver. "What the devil's this?" he said, stepping back. I'm sorry, sir. I was in a hurry and didn't see you." The man murmured angrily to himself. "Who would have thought it? Curse him. I can't get away from him." I'm sorry, sir," repeated Oliver, frightened by the man's wild, staring eyes. "The devil break your bones," the man said through his teeth. "What are you doing here?" He raised his hand and started towards Oliver with a mad look in his eyes, but fell violently to the ground, shaking and gasping in a fit. People hurried up and helped the man into the pub, while Oliver, thinking that the man was mad, ran quickly home. Mrs. Maylie and Oliver passed a sleepless night, and Rose grew steadily worse as the fever burned in her. Oliver said every prayer he had ever learnt 10 times over. Late the next day, Dr. Losberne and Harry Maylie arrived, and the house was full of worried faces and anxious whispers. But the danger passed, and by the next night Dr. Losberne was able to announce that though seriously ill, Rose would not die. Oliver cried for joy. A day or two later, Mrs. Maylie talked privately to her son. Harry was a handsome young man of about 25, with a cheerful, honest face and friendly manners. He was clearly very fond of Rose. "I know that you want to marry Rose," Mrs. Maylie told her son, "and she is the nicest person I know. But I want you to remember one thing. Her birth." "Mother, that means nothing to me," said the young man. "I love her." "I know you do, Harry, but she herself is well aware of her doubtful birth, and this might affect her answer if you ask her to marry you. I know you have ambitions to enter politics. If you marry a woman with a stain on her name, even though it's not her fault, it might spoil your chances of success in life. Society is cruel, Harry. people might use the knowledge of your wife's doubtful birth against you, and against your children too, and one day you might begin to regret your marriage." "Only a selfish man would do that, Mother," Harry answered impatiently. "No, I am quite determined. I have loved Rose for a long time, and nothing will ever change that." Mrs. Maylie sighed. "And she, I know, is very fond of you. But she herself may try to protect you and refuse an offer of marriage from you for your sake. Remember that, Harry. But now I must go back and sit with her." "Will you tell her how much I've worried about her?" asked Harry. "And how anxious I am to see her again?" "Of course I will," replied Mrs. Maylie. Some days after this conversation, Oliver was sitting in the room where he studied in the evenings. It was a warm night, and he'd been studying hard for some hours. He fell asleep at his desk and started dreaming. He dreamt that he was in Fagin's house again, and could see the old man sitting in his corner whispering to another man.
"Yes, my dear," he heard Fagin say. "You are right. That's him."
In Oliver's dream, the other man answered, "Of course it is. I told you I'd seen him. I'd recognise him anywhere. If I walked across his unmarked grave, I'd know it was him buried under the ground." He said this with such hatred that Oliver woke up from fear. In front of him, at the open window, so near he could almost touch them, were Fagin and the strange wild man he had bumped into outside the pub in the town. In a flash, they were gone. Oliver sat still, white with terror, for a second, then shouted loudly for help. Harry and Dr. Losberne came running, and hearing what had happened, they rushed outside into the night and searched the garden and the fields around. There was no sign of anybody. "It must have been a bad dream, Oliver," said Harry, breathless after running through the fields. He had heard all about Oliver's past from his mother. "No," replied Oliver, still frightened. "I saw them both as plainly as I see you now." Nothing more was seen or heard of the two men, and after a few days the event was forgotten. Rose recovered rapidly and was soon able to go outside again. Harry Maylie waited a few days, then, as his mother had expected, he asked Rose to marry him, and as his mother had warned him, Rose refused. "Don't you love me?" he asked her, holding her hand. "I do," she whispered. "But please try to forget me. It would ruin your future as a politician if anybody found out about my birth. I could never forgive myself." Harry paused for a few minutes. "Tell me one thing, dear Rose. Could you have accepted if your past had been different? Or if I'd been poor and friendless with no hope of riches or success?" "I could," answered Rose, covering her face to hide her tears. "But as you are, I can never be more than a friend to you." "I shall ask you once more," said Harry softly. "In a year's time, or less, I shall ask you to change your mind." The girl shook her head and smiled sadly. "No, it will be useless." Harry left the next day, having asked Oliver to write to him secretly with news of his mother and Rose. From an upstairs window, Rose watched him leave with tears in her eyes. Mr. Bumble was now a married man, and not a happy one. He was no longer a beadle, but the manager of the workhouse, and his wife, formerly Mrs. Corney, scolded and argued with him day and night. One evening, after a particularly violent fight, when she threw things at him and chased him out of the house, he went for a walk alone through the town. He felt very sorry for himself, and finally went into a pub to find comfort in gin and water. A tall, dark man, sitting in the corner, watched Mr. Bumble while he drank. The stranger's clothes were dusty and muddy, as if he had travelled a long way. Mr. Bumble began to feel uncomfortable at the man's hard stare, and tried to avoid meeting his eyes. "I've seen you before," the stranger said eventually. "You were the beadle here." "I was, But I don't recognise you. It doesn't matter. I came here to look for you, and I'm lucky to have found you. I'd like some information." He pushed a couple of coins across the table. "What information?" asked Mr. Bumble suspiciously, slipping the coins into his pocket. "About a workhouse birth. A boy called Oliver Twist." "Young Twist. I remember him. He was a dreadful—" "It's not him I want to talk about," interrupted the stranger. "I've heard enough of him. It's the old woman who was the nurse for his mother. Where is she?" "Oh, she died last winter," said Mr. Bumble. Then he remembered that his wife had been there when old Sally had died, and he realised that this information might be worth something. He told the man that one woman had been with the nurse when she died and had heard some secret from her. "Where can I find this woman?" the stranger asked quickly, showing in his pale face how important this was to him. "I can bring her to meet you tomorrow," said Mr. Bumble. "All right. Down by the river at 9 in the evening." The man wrote the address on a piece of paper. "And your name?" asked Mr. Bumble. "Monks," replied the stranger. "But you don't need to remember it." Then he quickly left the pub. The next evening was dark and cloudy. A storm threatened, and already the first drops of rain were falling. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble walked up the main street of the town, then turned towards a group of ruined old houses next to the river. Mr. Bumble went first, carrying a dim light, and his wife followed closely behind. At the oldest and most ruined building, they stopped, and Mr. Bumble took out his piece of paper. The first distant crash of thunder shook the air, and the rain began to pour down heavily. Then they heard Monks calling out of an upstairs window. "Is that the man?" Mrs. Bumble asked her husband. "Yes." "Then be careful to say as little as you can. Don't tell him I'm your wife." Monks opened a small door, saying impatiently, "Come in, don't keep me waiting." Mr. Bumble was only brave when dealing with poor, helpless people. He felt very uneasy about entering this dark building with an ill-tempered stranger. However, he was equally afraid of his wife. Nervously, he followed her through the door. Inside, Monks stared at Mrs. Bumble for some time. "So this is the woman, is it?" "Yes," replied Mr. Bumble cautiously. As they walked upstairs, there was a bright flash of lightning outside, followed by loud thunder. They sat down at the table, and Monks started immediately. "So you were present when the old woman died, is that right? And she told you something?" He stared at Mrs. Bumble again. "Yes," said Mrs. Bumble, "something about the mother of Oliver Twist, but first, how much will you pay me for the information?" "If it's what I want to hear, £25, said Monks. "But it's a lot of money for something which has been lying dead for 12 years. Reluctantly, he pushed the money across the table towards her, then bent forward to listen. The faces of the three nearly touched, as the two men leant over the table to hear what the woman had to say, and the woman leant over towards them so that they could hear her whisper. In the dim lamplight their faces looked pale and ghostly. "The old woman, who was the nurse, died with only me in the room," said Mrs. Bumble. "No one else was there?" asked Monks fiercely. "No one." "Good," said Monks. "Go on." "She spoke about a young woman who had given birth in the same bed some years before. The child was Oliver Twist, and this nurse had robbed the child's mother." "Robbed in life?" asked Monks. "In death. She stole from the body when it was hardly cold, but the old woman fell back and died before she could tell me more." "It's a lie," shouted Monks furiously. "You know more. I'll kill you both if you don't tell me what else she said." "She said no more," repeated Mrs. Bumble calmly, showing, unlike Mr. Bumble, no fear of the strange man's violence. "But in her hand I found a piece of dirty paper." "Which contained?" "Nothing. It was only a receipt from a pawnbroker. I went to the pawnbroker and got back a little gold locket. Inside was a gold wedding ring, and on the locket itself the name Agnes. She put the locket on the table in front of Monks. He picked it up immediately and looked at it closely, his hands shaking.
Is this all?
It is. And now I want to ask you a question. What do you intend to do with the locket?
This, so it can never be used against me.
Monks suddenly pushed the table to one side and opened a small door in the floor. Down below rushed the river, its muddy waters swollen by the heavy rain.
If you threw a man's body down there, where would it be tomorrow? Asked Monks.
12 miles down the river and cut to pieces, replied Mr. Bumble in a shaky voice. Monks tied the locket to a heavy weight and dropped it into the water. In a second it was gone. The three of them looked into each other's faces and seemed to breathe more freely.
Now we have nothing more to say, said Monks, with a threatening look at Mr. Bumble. And nothing to say to anyone else either. Do you understand?
Certainly, said Mr. Bumble very politely. He moved away from the strange man, anxious to leave quickly. At the door to the street, Monks turned again to Mr. Bumble.
And if we ever meet again, we don't know each other. Do you understand that as well?
Perfectly, said the relieved Mr. Bumble, moving away into the rain and pulling his wife with him. Chapter 11. Nancy makes a visit. On the evening after the Bumbles' little business meeting, Mr. Bill Sykes, waking from a sleep, called out to ask the time. The room he was lying in was very small and dirty. It was a different room from the one he had occupied before the Chertsey expedition, but it was in the same poor part of London. There were so few possessions or comforts in the room that it was clear Mr. Sykes had met hard times. He himself was thin and pale from illness, and was lying on the bed, wrapped in an old coat. The white dog lay on the floor next to him. Seated by the window was Nancy, repairing Sykes' old jacket. She too was thin and pale. At Sykes' voice, she raised her head from her work. "Not long past 7, she said. "How do you feel now, Bill?"
"As weak as water. Help me get up, will you?"
As Nancy helped him out of bed, Sykes swore and cursed at her clumsiness. Illness had not improved his temper. "You wouldn't speak like that if you knew how kindly I'd nursed you these last few days," said Nancy. "So many nights I've looked after you." She sat down in a chair, exhausted.
"Get up," shouted Sykes. "What's wrong with you?"
But Nancy was unable to get up. Her head fell back against the chair and she fainted. Sykes swore and cursed again, but Nancy remained unconscious. "What's the matter here?" asked a voice from the door, and Fagin, followed by the Artful Dodger and Charley Bates, entered the room. When they saw Nancy, they hurried to help her. Charley rubbed her hands, and the Dodger gave her a drink from the bottle he carried. Gradually, Nancy recovered her senses. Sykes then turned to Fagin.
"What are you here for?" he asked roughly. "You haven't been here for weeks, all the time I was ill. I haven't 2 coins to rub together. Why didn't you help me? You treat me worse than a dog."
"Don't be bad-tempered, my dear," said Fagin calmly. "I haven't forgotten you, Bill."
"Well, what about some money, then? I've done enough work for you recently. What about some money?"
"I haven't a single coin with me, my dear," said Fagin.
"Then go and get some. You've got lots at home." "No, I don't trust you. Nancy can go back with you to your house and fetch some money. I'll stay here and sleep." After a good deal of arguing, Fagin managed to reduce the amount Sykes was demanding from £5 to £3. He went back to his house with Nancy and the boys. When they were inside,
Fagin told the girl, "I'll just go upstairs and fetch the cash for Bill, my dear. There's little money in this business, Nancy, little money and no thanks, but I'm fond of seeing the young people around me." Suddenly there was a man's voice at the front door. As soon as Nancy heard it, she sat up in her chair. "That's the man I was expecting earlier," said Fagin. "Don't worry, he'll only be 10 minutes. The man entered the room. It was Monks. When he saw Nancy, he moved back, as if he had expected no one but Fagin. "It's all right, only one of my young people," Fagin said to him. "Did you see him?" "Yes," answered Monks. "Any news?" "Good news," said Monks with a smile. "Let me have a word with you." He and Fagin went upstairs to talk privately. As soon as they had left the room, Nancy took off her shoes and crept silently up the stairs to listen in the passage, as she had done once before. She was gone for a quarter of an hour. Then, like a ghost, she reappeared in the downstairs room and sat down. Immediately afterwards, the two men descended the stairs. "How pale you are, Nancy," said Fagin, once Monks had left the house. "What have you been doing to yourself?" "Nothing, except waiting here for you too long," she answered, turning her face away from him. "Now, where's the money for Bill?" With a sigh for every piece of money, Fagin put the agreed amount into her hand. When Nancy was out in the street again, she sat down on a doorstep and for a few minutes seemed unable to move. Then she started running wildly through the streets, and when she was exhausted she stopped and burst into tears. This strange mood seemed to leave her then, and she turned and hurried back to Sykes' house. At first, when she returned, Sykes noticed nothing unusual about her. Fagin, with his sharp, suspicious eyes, would have noticed something at once. But as night came, the girl's nervous excitement increased, and even Sykes was alarmed by the paleness in her cheeks and the fire in her eye. He lay in bed, drinking hot gin and water and staring at her. "You look like a corpse that's come back to life again. What's the matter with you tonight?" "Nothing. Why are you staring at me so hard?" "Either you've caught the fever yourself or... No, you're not going to... You wouldn't do that." "Do what?" asked the girl. "There's not a girl alive as loyal as you. If you weren't, I'd have cut your throat months ago. No, you must have the fever coming on, that's it. Now, give me some of my medicine." Nancy quickly poured out his medicine with her back to him. He took it, and after turning restlessly for some time, he eventually fell into a deep, heavy sleep. "The drug's taken effect at last," Nancy said to herself as she rose from her position beside the bed. "I hope I'm not too late." Quickly, she put on her coat and hat, looking round fearfully as if she expected at any moment to feel Sykes' heavy hand on her shoulder. She kissed the robber's lips softly, then ran from the house without a sound. She hurried in the direction of West London, pushing past people on the pavement and running across crowded streets without looking. "The woman is mad," said the people, turning to look at her as she rushed past them. She came to a wealthier part of the town, where the streets were quieter, and before long she had reached her destination. It was a family hotel in a quiet street near Hyde Park. The clock struck 11 as she entered. The man at the desk looked at her and asked, "What do you want here?" "I want to see Miss Maylie." The man looked at the young woman with strong disapproval. "She won't want to see someone like you. Come on, get out." "Let me see her, or two of you will have to throw me out," said Nancy violently. The man looked at her again, and decided it would be easier to do as she asked. He led her upstairs to Rosie's room. Nancy entered with a brave face, but with fear in her heart. "Please sit down and tell me why you wish to see me," said Rose Maylie. looking with some surprise at this poor, rough girl from the streets. Rose's manner was so kind and sincere, and so unexpected, that Nancy burst into tears. When she had recovered a little, she asked,
"Is the door shut?"
"Yes," answered Rose a little nervously. "But why?"
"Because I am about to put my life and the lives of others in your hands. I am the girl that kidnapped little Oliver and took him back to old Fagin's house on the night Oliver was going to the bookseller."
"You?" said Rose.
"Yes, it was me. I am that wicked creature you have heard about. I've no friends except thieves and robbers. I've lived on the street since I was a child, cold, hungry, among people who are always drunk and fighting, and that's where I'll die too."
"I pity you," said Rose in a broken voice.
"But I'll tell you why I'm here. Do you know a man called Monks?"
"No," answered Rose.
"He knows you. I heard him tell Fagin that you were at this hotel. Maybe he's changed his name. Soon after Oliver was put into your house on the night of the robbery, I listened in secret to a conversation between Monks and Fagin in the dark. And I heard Monks say that he'd seen Oliver in the street and that he knew at once Oliver was the child he was looking for, although I couldn't hear why. Monks then agreed to pay Fagin some money if he could find Oliver again, and more money if he could turn the poor boy into a thief."
"Why?" asked Rose.
"He saw my shadow on the wall as I listened and I had to escape. I didn't see him again until last night."
"And what happened then?"
"I listened at the door again, and I heard Monks say this: 'So the only proof of the boy's identity is at the bottom of the river, and the old woman who received it is dead.' He and Fagin laughed. Then Monks said that he had all Oliver's money safely now, but how funny it would be if the boy went to prison for stealing after his father's unfair will."
"What is all this?" asked Rose.
"It's the truth, lady. Then Monks said he couldn't have Oliver killed because suspicion would point to himself, but he'd try for the rest of his life to harm the boy if he could. Then Monks laughed again about the money Oliver should have got from his father's will. 'My young brother, Oliver, will never see that money,' he said."
"His brother?" exclaimed Rose.
"Those were his words,"
said Nancy, looking round uneasily, as if she still expected to see Sikes.
"And then he talked about how amazed you would be if you knew who Oliver really was."
"And this man was serious?"
"His voice was full of anger and hatred. I know many people who do worse things, but I'd rather listen to all of them than to this man Monks. But I must get back now, or people will wonder where I've been."
"Back?
"How can you go back to such a life?" asked Rose. "You've told me all this. Now I can help you by letting you stay somewhere safe." "No. Perhaps it's hard for you to believe, but there's one man, the most dangerous of them all, that I can never leave. You're the first person who's ever spoken to me so kindly, but it's too late."
"It's never too late."
"It is," cried the girl. "I can't leave him now. And if I tell anyone about this man, he'll die."
"But how can I find you again when we want to investigate this mystery further?"
"I'll meet you secretly, if you promise not to watch or follow me," said Nancy. "And if you promise just one more thing, not to do anything to hurt the man I can never leave."
"I promise."
"Every Sunday night, between 11 and 12, I will walk on London Bridge if I am alive. Meet me there if you want more information."
As Nancy said these words, she left the room and ran down the stairs and out into the street once more. Rose was left alone, her thoughts in great confusion, as she wondered desperately what to do and who to ask for advice. The next morning, Oliver, who had been out walking, ran into Rose's room at the hotel. He was breathless with excitement.
"I can't believe what I've seen. Now you'll all know that I've told you the truth," he shouted.
"I know you've always told us the truth, but what are you talking about?" asked Rose.
"I've seen Mr. Brownlow, the kind man who was so good to me."
"Where?"
"Going into a house," said Oliver, crying with joy. "I've got the address here."
"Quick," said Rose, "call a coach. I'll take you there immediately." The idea came to Rose that perhaps Mr. Brownlow would advise her. She had been afraid to tell Nancy's story to Dr. Losberne, since the good doctor was very excitable and often acted with more enthusiasm than wisdom. In less than 5 minutes they were in the coach on their way to the address. Rose went in first to talk to Mr. Brownlow alone. She was taken into his study, and polite greetings were exchanged. When they were seated again, Rose said, "This will surprise you very much, but you were once very kind to a dear friend of mine, and I'm sure you will be interested to hear news of him."
"Really? May I ask you his name?"
"Oliver Twist." Mr. Brownlow said nothing for a few seconds, but simply stared at Rose. Finally he moved his chair nearer to her and said with great feeling, "I once thought that he was a liar and a thief. If you have evidence to show me I was wrong, please tell me at once." "I know him to be a child with a warm heart," said Rose, "and despite the hardships of his life, he's a better person than almost anyone I know."
"I looked for him everywhere," said Mr. Brownlow, "but I could never find him. I could never quite believe that he really did intend to rob me."
Rose told him everything that had happened to Oliver since then. She finished by saying, "And his only sorrow for some months has been that he could not find you, his former friend."
"Thank God," said Mr. Brownlow. "This is great happiness to me, great happiness. But why haven't you brought him with you, Miss Maylie?"
"He's waiting in a coach at the door," replied Rose. Mr. Brownlow hurried out of the room, down the stairs, and into the coach without another word. In a minute he had returned with Oliver.
"How well he looks," he said. "New clothes, the same sweet face, but not so pale. The same eyes, but not so sad."
They talked with great joy for some time. Then Mr. Brownlow sent for Mrs. Bedwin, the old housekeeper. She came in quietly and waited for her orders.
"You get blinder every day," said Mr. Brownlow impatiently.
"People's eyes at my time of life don't improve with age," replied the old lady.
"Then put on your glasses."
As she searched for them in her pocket, Oliver could not wait any longer and ran into her arms.
"Dear God," she said, "it's my innocent boy." "My dear old nurse," cried Oliver. "I knew he would come back," said the old lady, holding him in her arms. "How well he's dressed, how well he looks again."
She laughed and cried at the same time, and could not let Oliver go. While Oliver talked to Mrs. Bedwin, Rose asked Mr. Brownlow if she could speak to him privately. He led her into another room, and there listened, with a good deal of amazement, to Rose's account of her extraordinary conversation with Nancy. Between them, they decided that Mrs. Maylie and Dr. Losberne should be told, and that Mr. Brownlow would come to the hotel that evening for a discussion. For the moment, nothing would be said to Oliver himself. That evening at the hotel, Oliver's 4 friends met as arranged. Dr. Losberne, of course, was full of immediate plans to rush round London, arresting all the gang and hanging them at once. Mr. Brownlow, fortunately, was able to persuade him to abandon this wild idea.
"Then what's to be done?" cried the doctor impatiently.
"First," said Mr. Brownlow calmly, "we must discover who Oliver's parents were. Then, if this girl's story is true, we must regain the inheritance that should have been his."
"Yes, yes," said the doctor, nodding in agreement. "But how shall we achieve these aims?"
"We must find this man Monks," said Mr. Brownlow. "Nancy will not betray the man who is special to her, but she will surely agree to tell us how or where to find Monks. Then we must find a way to force Monks to talk. We must be both cautious and clever. After all, we have no proof against him, and if we cannot make him talk, this mystery will never be solved. But we'll have to wait 5 days until Sunday before we can meet Nancy on London Bridge. Until then, we can do nothing.
Chapter 12. Nancy keeps an appointment. On exactly the same night as Nancy had met Rose Maylie, 2 people from Oliver's hometown were making their way towards London. Their progress was slow, since they travelled on foot, and in addition the girl was carrying a heavy bag on her back. The young man carried nothing. From time to time he turned to shout at the girl behind him. "Hurry up! What a lazy creature you are, Charlotte! I'll come and give you a kick if you don't move faster." The young man was Noah Claypole, who had made Oliver's life so miserable at Mr. Sowerberry's house. He was now taller and uglier, but otherwise little changed. He and Charlotte had grown tired of the undertaking business and had set off to London to start a new life, with all the money from Mr. Sowerberry's shop in their pockets. Eventually they entered London, and Noah began to look for a quiet, cheap pub where they could spend the night. Charlotte followed obediently at his heels as they walked through a district of narrow, dirty streets. At last Noah found a pub that he thought was suitable. It was dark and dirty, with a few rough-looking men in the bar. They entered and asked for a room for the night and a meal of cold meat and beer, which they ate in the bar. The beer made Noah talkative, and he began to boast. "So it's no more coffins for us, my girl. We can do better than just robbing Mr. Sowerberry. In London there are pockets, houses, coaches, even banks." "I like the sound of it, Noah, but how are we going to do all this?" asked Charlotte. "We can meet people who know about these things. I'd like to be the leader of some gang if there's a good profit to be made in that kind of work." Noah felt very pleased with himself and looked forward to an easy life of crime in the capital. They talked about their plans for a few minutes. Then